we have Gordon Chang with Forbes.com, and incredible expert on Asia. You've seen him on Fox and many of the other networks, and you've certainly heard him on John Batchelor's program in the evening. And Gordon Chang, it's a pleasure to have you joining John and I on the Final Say Radio Show.
Well, thank you so very much.
Well, it's one of our favorite topics. I guess we're intrigued by Asia, and we're intrigued by the Middle East because we spend so much time discussing it. But I'd love to have you join in our conversation so you can kind of outline for us the relationship over time between China and North Korea, and how, if any, that has changed as North Korea has now had its third nuclear test and seems to be going on its own course more than it has in the past.
Well, fundamentally, North Korea and China are been allies for more than 6 decades. This has really started when North Korea was formed in 1948, and it's continued on since then. And as we know, China rescued North Korea during the Korean War, and although the relationship has not been as close as it was then, nonetheless, Beijing today still is North Korea's enabler because it provides something like around 90% of its energy, 80% of consumer goods, 45% of food, most of it on concessionary terms. And as well, China is North Korea's only reliable backer in international councils like the UN Security Council. So essentially what we've got here is a firm partnership. Now, this is not to mean that there haven't been tensions recently, because there clearly has. But one thing is that the North Koreans know that the Chinese will not abandon them. So even though the North Koreans and the Chinese may suffer down periods like they have one right now, this is still a very close relationship.
What's interesting to me is we see the change in leadership in China with Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe taking over in Japan. I forget the guy's name in South Korea who's taking over as well. And, of course, you've got the new, the son taking over in North Korea. The only mainstay seems to be Barack Obama, but he seems to be the quietest on the issues here of an increasingly belligerent North Korea and really a China that hasn't done what we would expect them to do in trying to contain it.
Well, yeah, President Obama's policy towards North Korea has really been a quiet one. It's allowed South Korea's President Lee Myung-bak to set the tone of what's going on. And the new president, Park Geun-hye, who is the daughter of Park Chung-hee, the South Korean dictator in the 60s and the 70s, she is pretty much going to continue along President Yee's policy. The one thing about President Obama's policy is that towards North Korea is that up until, let's say, 6 months ago, it wasn't really that bad. And certainly it was no worse than the Bush administration's policy. Because when it comes to North Korea, we've got bipartisan failure. But what we have seen in the last space of 2 months is North Korea crossing 2 very important technical thresholds. In December, they launched a 3-stage ballistic missile, and they put a satellite into orbit. And, of course, on Tuesday, they detonated a powerful nuclear weapon, perhaps even a miniature one. So North Korea is within 3 to 5 years of being able to incinerate any American city. And what we really need is what the president talked about a couple days ago, and that is swift and credible action. But so far, we haven't seen it. Certainly hasn't been swift. And it doesn't look credible. So this is a question of a failure of American policy at a critical juncture.
Well, yeah, now I want to bring another nation into this because it seems to me that Iran and North Korea have been cooperating, and there's a connection there for many years as they've both been working towards either developing or improving upon their nuclear program. And I would call them both nuclear states, being that at the very least, they both have nuclear scientists, they have nuclear programs, and they have the ability to develop nuclear energy as well.
Well, right now, we have seen this very, very close partnership. North Koreans detonated 3 nuclear devices to our knowledge, 2006, 2009, and on Tuesday. For the first 2 tests, Iranians were on site in North Korea. Preliminary intelligence says that the Iranians were on site in 2006, 2009, and preliminary intelligence says that the Iranians were on site on Tuesday as well. That shouldn't be a surprise because North Korea has been selling its nuclear technologies to the Iranians for quite some time. You know that North Korean reactor in the Syrian desert that the Israelis destroyed in September 2007? Well, Iran paid for that. And we also know that North Korea sold processed uranium and other nuclear cooperation. And to round this out, all of the Iranian ballistic missiles are North Korean ones. They've just been repainted and renamed. So there is a long and unfortunately a very effective partnership between North Korea and Iran, not only on nuclear weapons, but ballistic missiles as well.
So, Gordon, one of the things that concerns me here is it feels like we have some halfway decent, or at least the Israelis do, intelligence in Iran. But I worry about how much intelligence we actually have in North Korea. Do you have a sense of how good our intelligence is and where our administration actually acquires the knowledge we need so that we can make good decisions?
Yeah, we have very little intelligence on what goes on in North Korea, unfortunately. We do have, of course, intelligence that we can gather from technical means, but we have very little human intelligence. And this has been a sort of the natural consequence of trying to isolate North Korea. So that's one of the things that unfortunately comes as part of the necessary policies to try to strangle the regime. And what we need to do going forward is not so much get more intelligence, but what we need to do is get rid of the regime. And people say that we can't do it, we don't have any leverage over the Chinese. Well, all of that is wrong because we do have the means to strangle North Korea. It's just that we don't have the will to use it. And this is not just a Barack Obama problem. He doesn't have the will, but neither did his predecessor. And we have seen bipartisan failure over North Korea going back generations.
But isn't this? I tend to agree with you completely on that. But isn't this as much a problem with both the American public and the poor use of the bully pulpit? Right. Obama's using the bully pulpit for gun control, and he's creating all kinds of conversation, even though it affects a relatively small amount of people, like these school incidents, as opposed to the importance of let's say disarming a nuclear terrorist nation. And if people understood this, don't you think the majority of American people would trend further away from Chinese goods, rattling the baseline of the Chinese economy, if they really understood how much this affects our future?
Well, I wish that they would, and that's a pretty complicated issue. I think that we are going to find Americans buying less Chinese goods, and the reason is that China is becoming inhospitable to manufacturing, especially low-end manufacturing, much of which is actually leaving China. But to your point about what Americans would do, if we knew and if we actually looked at what China was doing to undermine the United States, clearly we would have a much different attitude about buying Chinese goods because we have seen the Chinese, for instance, attack an American vessel, and our administration said nothing about it. This happened in March 2009 in the South China Sea. They harassed the Impeccable. They tried to cut the towed sonar array, and we said nothing about this. I mean, Americans would be outraged if they knew that the Chinese sold the North Koreans 6 mobile missile launchers, which the North Koreans displayed in their April 15th parade last year. This substantially increases North Korea's ability to wage nuclear war. We didn't say anything about this in public. The list just goes on. China is proliferating nuclear weapons technology to the Iranians, and we do nothing about it. Condoleezza Rice does nothing when she knows that the Chinese have been allowing the North Koreans to use Chinese airspace to ship ballistic missiles to Iran. I'm sorry, the one before it hasn't done anything about this. We need to change perceptions about China because China has said very clearly that they want to wage war on the United States. And I'm sorry, this is the same dynamic that we saw with al-Qaeda up to 9/11. Up to 9/11, it didn't really matter what al-Qaeda did, and then all of a sudden it did. We need to have a better conversation about China before more Americans die.
Well, sure. They're fighting a currency war They're fighting an intellectual property war. They're fighting a mineral and resource war. They're fighting a hegemony war. I mean, they're fighting us on so many fronts. And you're right. We have a dearth of leadership addressing this for a long time. I wanted to change the direction here slightly because one of the other major concerns, and you sort of brought this up or started going down this path, there is, to me, a huge, I feel like we are weakening our military technology, but we're also allowing, instead of working very closely with our allies like South Korea so that the U.S. can keep a very strong military-industrial complex and sort of outsource that security umbrella to let these other nations who can afford to pay more for our security, we're leaving them hanging. And then, that requires them to then start producing and creating more of their own weapons, which actually weakens our ability to have more control and influence in the future. And it feels like China is very quickly winning this this sort of game of brinksmanship for how we use military weapons to control our foreign policy, not just firing military weapons, but how we sell them and how we provide them and nations procure them. You want to touch on that subject if you understood where I was going with it?
Yeah, I mean, that is important. But we do sell a lot of military equipment around the world. I mean, we probably sell more than anybody else in the last couple of years. But nonetheless, your point is right. We could sell more. And this is a whole issue of, for instance, our relationships with India. We had lost out on a major contract with India for a number of reasons. Part of it, I think, is lack of government support. We should have been selling weapons to Taiwan when Taiwan wanted to actually buy them, and now Taiwan doesn't really want to buy them, and this is partly our fault. We should be selling more weapons to Japan because Japan has the ability to buy them. There are some certain issues that we have here, and that is we don't sell our top-of-the-line Air Force fighter, the F-22 Raptor. Although the Japanese want to buy it, and although some other countries want to buy it, they can't. I mean, there's U.S. law that prohibits that, and I think that we shouldn't be selling the Raptor. But there's a lot of equipment that we should be selling, that we could be selling, and that we are not selling. So I agree with the general thrust of your comments.
Yeah, Gordon, I'm glad that we went in this direction because one of my concerns is that it seems in the Middle East we're more than willing to provide tanks and F-16s to Egypt, as we see, what I would consider to be a current and former terrorist organization take over the government there. But when it comes to our allies such as South Korea and Japan that you mentioned, and Taiwan, so I'm glad you mentioned them as well, that we are so hesitant. And I want to bring up a recent incident because according to the Japanese, the Chinese actually have locked in on them in recent times out in the Pacific there, Chinese Sea. And to me, that's a provocative action on China's part, but we've seen plenty of provocation on the North Koreans' part. But I think when you put it all together, we need to show more strength as a nation and support our friends as well.
Well, you're absolutely right. What you're referring to is that on January 19th, the Chinese turned on their weapons targeting radar on a Japanese helicopter in the East China Sea. On January 30th, they turned on their radar on a Japanese frigate. The Chinese deny that they do it, but the Japanese have the evidence, and they very well may publicly disclose it. And you're absolutely right. This is an extremely provocative action. Today, wars don't start until someone turns on their targeting radar, and there are very few things that you can do beyond turning on your targeting radar short of the use of force. So this is something that the United States needs to be much clearer about in terms of defending Japan. Last year, we essentially reneged on our mutual defense treaty with the Philippines when we allowed the Chinese to take Scarborough Shoal. Now, the reason why we reneged was because we thought maybe if we didn't oppose the Chinese that they would calm down. But clearly they haven't, because having been emboldened by taking Scarborough Shoal, they're now trying to take Japanese islands. So clearly this is going to be a problem. This is where you've got to stop aggressors when you can. We didn't do this, in the run-up to World War II. The British and the French, us, of course, were very hesitant to opposing the Germans. and we know how that turned out. 75 million people died in World War II. And right now we see essentially the same dynamic playing out in the South China and the Yellow Seas. The United States under Secretary Clinton has shown some very important initiatives. Unfortunately, she's gone, and unfortunately, Assistant Secretary of State Campbell is gone. And now we got John Kerry, who has all the wrong instincts on China. Just one little note, though. Although Kerry is not going to do the right things on China initially, Beijing is not going to cooperate with him. And so I think that essentially he's going to come up in the same place that Secretary Clinton found herself, and that he's going to end up opposing China resolutely because he has no choice. We have a president right now who wants to talk about green jobs and the Second Amendment. Well, that's fine. But as you point out, we've also got a situation where Americans could easily get dragged into what could be the beginning of the world's next great conflict, and that will be in East Asia, not in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I'm equally as worried as you are. You mentioned some of the names. Kerry is very concerning to me. I'm worried about Valerie Jarrett, who's probably the longest advisor in the administration at this point. And then you have the appointments of, and not yet confirmed, of Brennan and Hagel, which I think are even more scary than the first two names.
And you also have Thomas Donnellan in the NSC, who is also the wrong instincts. These people should have realized President Obama, like every president, comes into office thinking he can do better on China than his predecessor, and he had these unusually conciliatory attitudes. Well, essentially what happened is the Chinese pushed him around because they thought he was weak. And so then he ended up sponsoring the pivot, which was a necessary corrective to his policy and to the Bush administration policies. But now, they seem to have forgotten what they learned in 2011. You have Kerry, you possibly have Hagel, you got Donnellan, you got all these people who don't know how to deal with China. And so essentially we're going to have to go through the learning curve again. The problem, of course, is that when you go through the learning curve at a later date, as they seem to be doing, you end up with the real conflict, with the real possibility of conflict. And we have that right now. You point out the targeting radar incidents in January. That is very, very provocative. The United States needs to have a very resolute, very public position, because if we don't do this, we're going to find ourselves dragged into war in East Asia.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm actually failing to understand what the policy is involved in this Asian pivot, because while we've announced it, it seems to me that we're doing what he does best, and I guess that's just leading from behind or watching from behind in this case.
Well, yeah, and you can't do that right now. There are times when you have to stand up to aggressors, and you have to do it not just in private, but you have to do it in public. And this administration, especially now that Secretary Clinton is gone, because she was willing to do this. She was willing to tell the Chinese off. She's not there anymore, which means that this is a problem. We need a Secretary of State to tell the Chinese to back off, because if we don't do that, they think that they can take even more territory. This is in the East China Sea. I heard that Cato Institute expert say, these are just worthless rocks. But the point is, the senkakus are just the first step. The Chinese have been talking not just about taking the senkakus away from Japan. They've been talking about taking Okinawa and the rest of the Ryukyu chain. So this is like, where do you stop these people? Do you stop them at the Rhineland? Do you stop them in Austria? Do you stop them in Czechoslovakia? At some point, you have to stop them. And World War II says we tried to stop them in Poland when it was much too late to avoid conflict. I'd like to see conflict avoided, but we are taking all those steps that are creating the conditions for war.
And history does often repeat itself, and we've got plenty of history to look at, and it's a great example. Gordon, really appreciate you joining us today on The Final Say. Which website could our listeners go to find out more about you and follow your stories and your other notes?
www.gordonchang.com, and I tweet at Gordon G. Chang.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much. Gordon Chang with Forbes.com.